Okay, let's check it out. That's sliding pretty good now. Hey, welcome back. I hope everybody's enjoying the weekend, and this is going to be a follow-up video on our miter saw fence build. Now I'm going to try to make this video cater to everybody. There's going to be some folks that just want to know how it works and what does it cost. And then I'm sure there's going to be some folks that want to know a lot more details about it. Pros and cons, some more construction details about it, and maybe even some ways to improve it in the future. Stay tuned. We'll get to those. What does it do? What is it for? Well, I'm sure everybody's seen where you'll take a block of wood sometimes and you might clamp it to your saw or even clamp it to your work table, and that way you can do repetitive cuts. So not only does it take care of that for you, but it also kind of eliminates the tape measure. I'd always keep a tape measure on hand to double check stuff, but instead of having to pull your tape measure out and then mark you a line, and then you got to line the line up with the saw to cut it, all I have to do is set my stop, crank it down, and I'm already cutting lumber. So it's great for repetitive work, but it saves a whole lot of time on each individual cut as well. Alright, so how does it work? Well, we got our knob. It loosens it up. Let's just slide it around. We also have our adjustment screw to fine tune it. And then to set it, we're going to set our leading edge right here to 22 inches. Snug it back up. And now we're ready to cut. We can make repetitive cuts all day long just like that. Some of you may be wondering, well, that's nice, but what if you want to cut less than 11.5 inches? If you notice in my case, the smallest I could set my stop to is 11.5 inches. And that's very common when you have a measured fence stop like this. Now a smaller 10-inch miter saw and even a radial arm saw, you'll get a lot closer. You may get down to 6 inches or so, but you're still going to have to use a block at some point. What I like to do is make me a nice 10-inch block. I round over the edges, mark it, that way it don't get lost. And now if I want a 6-inch piece, all I do is set it at 16 inches. And now I could cut 6-inch blocks. And I could already hear some of you who are great at math saying, well, that will only get you down to 1.5 inches. Well, I don't see myself doing a lot of cutting at 1.5 inches and below. That's just not my style of woodworking. If I do need to do a lot of cutting that low, I'll cut me a special block for that job. But the 10-inch block is a lot easier math, and that's why I like the 10-inch versus the 12-inch block. Performance and function? It actually locks in place pretty dang good. In fact, if you've ever used anything similar to this, you know smacking it with a board might move it. This one will take a pretty good smacking. That moved about a 32nd, but you're never going to hit it that hard when you're just feeding lumber into it. As far as to loosen it up, it takes about a half a turn. And it slides up and down the rail pretty easy. I think we can make it better, and I'll show you how later in the video. For cost, I have about $8 in the knob and the 3/8 coupler. I got that at Home Depot. For the stick-on tape, I have about $8 from Amazon. Unistrut was about $32 from Home Depot. And then I only had about $3 in hardware. I gave you a very generous allowance of $25. And then for lumber, I was given a very nice piece of maple. So I gave you an allowance for about $25. That's a very generous allowance there. The piece of scrap metal is so hard to price that we got to assume somewhere, if you're doing this at home, you had a part or piece of this. So I came up with $51 and then $98, and that's going to be for all the way up to a 10-foot piece of track. Adjustment's pretty self-explanatory. If you need it to cut bigger, you just screw the bolt in. If you need it to cut smaller, you'd screw the bolt out. What I do want to point out though is when you have this setup with the bolt and the jam nut, what will happen is you'll get your settings set exactly where you want it, and you'll go to set the jam nut and it'll turn on you. That's very common on equipment. You'll run into this setup a lot. And what you'll see people do all the time is they'll try to hold one with one wrench and then try to tighten with the other wrench. And I don't like to do that. I like to try to see how much it's moving and then anticipate where it needs to stop. I have this set where I want it now, and I went ahead and put a Sharpie mark on it. I don't know if you could see that or not, but a lot of times a Sharpie mark or some type of mark can help you see movement a lot easier. And now I'm going to snug it up by hand the best I can, and then put a wrench on it. So if you notice, my mark didn't move any at all, so I'm golden. I like where I'm at, and I'm going to do another test shot. If your mark did move, you could use that as a reference to know how much to back it off and then readjust it. Alright, looking at my list now, I think we're going to move into pros and cons. Now this is going to be strictly about this system, pros and cons of this system. It's not going to be this system versus other systems. So we'll go through this pretty quick. For my pros, I got that it's pretty heavy duty. I mean, you're not going to wear that out anytime soon. The tape's protected, it's in a good spot. We'll talk more about that later. Next pro, I'd have to say you could get everything for repair local. All the bolts, knobs, all that you could find local. The only thing I would actually have a hard time finding local would be the stick-on tape. I did have to order that on Amazon. And my last one is going to be as cheap. You see, I pulled it off for $51, but even if you had to pay full price for everything, I still think you could do it cheaper than most systems you'd have to buy. Alright, so it's been a few days, and let me tell you what happened. So I'm in here, I'm working on this video, I'm minding my own business, and a good friend of mine calls and says, "Hey Josh, let's go to the river." I'm like, "Hey, sure, let's go to the river. Who doesn't want to go to the river?" So we go out there and we're doing, well, river things. And I go to hike up the ridge. I wanted to stick a couple of these way up on a ridge. And on my way down, I lose my footing. After a cartwheel and a couple backward somersaults, I land on my head, feet all up above me, tangled in a tree. Luckily, I walked away fine, but sure didn't feel like walking around much the next day. But anyways, here we are. We're going to pick back on our list on our cons. And really starting right off, my first con is there's no flip-up system. There's no way to get this out of your way if you needed to quick. One thing I've done to alleviate that in some situations is I'll just shim it out with some scrap wood. And that may solve your problems in some situations. Of course, it's not going to work in every situation. With that being said, I don't think I'd ever trust that for square. I think if I ever had to cut something like that, I would cut it long, and then once I could get it on the fence, I'd square it up, make it more accurate. Your other alternative is just pulling this out of the way. You could either unscrew it and take it apart, or slide it off the other end. For my second con, I put equipment and time, and this does take a little bit more broad range of equipment to pull off, and a little bit of time to put together. I don't think there's enough savings to justify for a lot of people of just buying some of the systems out there, but that's all up to individual circumstances and preference. The last con I have on my list is going to be this track filling up with sawdust. If you have a good dust collection system on your saw, that's probably not going to be an issue. And we were doing medium-sized cabinet jobs without it being an issue. We was able to blow it out in between jobs and it wasn't hampering us at all. Of course, there's a lot more pros and cons in my particular fence system here, especially versus other manufactured systems, but that was the top 3 I came up with. Now, for those who's never been around a fence system, here's one major con that I think you're going to find with a lot of fence systems, is it is going to hamper the ability of your saw. For example, if you built your fence right up to the cut on a radial arm saw, you'll never be able to angle that radial arm saw. One thing that hurt with my saw is I can't get my fence back on. It's supposed to slide on this way. On this particular saw, I think I could do just a little bit of clearancing and I'll be able to drop it back in. However, once I get that in there, I'll never be able to adjust it side to side. I don't think that's going to be a problem for me. If I ever need to do a compound miter, I could pull it out and build a temporary fence. I don't do a lot of that. That's just not my style of woodworking. But if you're looking at a fence system and you do a lot of compound miters, you really need to see how they're going to work together. Now we're going to look at the construction real quick, and the first question you may have is why use 7/8 unistrut instead of building the whole fence out of the 1 5/8 unistrut. And what I found with my use of unistrut, I've used a whole lot of it, is the 1 5/8, you could almost pinch the sides in by hand if you got strong enough hands. So there's a real good chance of there being a deflection in there. with us wanting to use it as a slide rail, the 7/8 gives us a lot truer and better structure to build that on. And that's why we use the 7/8. With that being said, if we would have tried to build everything on the 7/8 platform, we would have been real tight on space. Our bolt would have been right there on our tape, and then our lumber would have also covered up the tape. So we needed a spacer. So that's where the wood came in play. That was the first purpose of it, was to give us a spacer. And then as it turned out, using the dime like we did to space this unistrut and lumber out has two purposes. The first one is your unistrut's not going to be square. So spacing that wood out like we did gave us a square platform to build off of. It also gave us a little channel for our tape to run. Now our sled slides on the lumber down here, and it protects our tape from wear and tear. So the last thing I want to emphasize about the construction is make sure you go ahead and buy hardware and bolt it all down. Don't trust screws. If you try to screw it down, it's not going to hold up. You'll thank me later. Invest in the hardware, bolt it down, your saw and everything nice and tight. And with that being said, we need to talk about a safety issue we just created. A lot of you have been using fences a long time. Maybe some of you are just now looking into fences, but there is a safety issue. It's similar to a table saw. Between a fence and the blade, there's a bind point. And let me zoom you in here closer and we'll talk more about it. So what we've done is we've created a pinch point. Similar to on a table saw, we got a fence over here and a blade spinning over here. And what we don't want to happen is for this piece to come loose. So this is a side we really need to always hold down or be able to access with our hands. If we're holding this down, our blade's going to pass through without an issue. But as soon as we let go, it picks that piece up. And what's going to happen is the blade's going to catch it. And this is going to explode. It's going to throw shrapnel everywhere. And it even gets worse when you're using the 10-inch block, because now you got another variable. Now you have two pieces that could shake loose and twist. So you really got to be aware of that. Make sure you always hold down on the fence side, and that way you won't have it jumping loose and binding up in the saw. So like I said, there's a couple things we could do to improve this. And there's one thing that I'm kind of kicking myself in the butt for. I didn't quite get how I wanted. And that was a piece of 1/4 inch. I wanted to be able to catch a 1/4 inch either from this way or laying down. And we didn't quite catch it laying down. And what's going to affect that is either the thickness of the wood or obviously the height of the assembly. And you notice in the video I took more and more out of the thickness, but I didn't quite land there. And I think what I would do in the future, or if I ever tear this apart, is I'm going to plane this wood down until it's pretty much flush with the assembly there, and then let the washers build my gap. If you haven't built yours yet, just make your assembly a little taller so that your wood can remain a good thickness, and you'll be alright. So one more thing I want to do to make this a little better is it's sliding pretty good, but I noticed this unistrut, the galvanized on it was real gritty. So I'm going to take some sandpaper. I'm going to sand the top of these rails. I'm going to spend just a few minutes doing that. And then I'm going to take some wax and I'm going to wax the rails, and then I'm going to wax this piece of front lumber right here, and we'll see how it does after that. Alright, moment of truth. Oh wow, that's sliding good. That's working real good. Well, that's going to wrap up this video. This is just supposed to be a follow-up video of the miter saw fence build. And I hope I answered some questions of not only mine, but just fences in general. If you got any questions, hit me up in the comments below. I will get back with you. And in the meantime, thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time.